Welcome home. We are WNST, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore. We are Baltimore Positive. We hope you set a spot on your dial when you're driving around Baltimore. We hope you join us on Friday over Pizza John's. We'll be at Essex. All of it brought to you by the Maryland Lottery. The Magic 8-Ball scratch-offs. I have a handful of these left. You're going to get some Monopoly scratch-offs when we get the party started after opening day. We will be at Fadley's on the 2nd of April. That's a Wednesday. It's not opening day. It's the second opening day, as they used to say. The Red Sox will be in town. Luke and I will be convening. Also have some great guests. I think Mark Viviano's coming down that day. And we're going to have some fun. Jamie Costello's joining me at Coco's later on in the month in April. So we have Maryland Crab Cake Tour stops everywhere, including at CVP in Towson. Last Friday, we had Pat Scarry. We had Patrick McQuown from the startup. We also had Susan Selkman, who is a hot yoga devotee, much like myself at Updog in Towson. So we talked some hot yoga, and Brian Baldinger and the NFL Network and all sorts of things. Luke and I have talked Ravens at length. You can check that out at Baltimore Positive or at AM 1570, anywhere podcast or YouTube or where you find our work. And we are appreciative that you do find our work after all of these years. We're going to be working in Canada together. Luke Jones has his passport out. We are headed to Toronto for opening day for all things Zach Eflin taking the hill. I am wearing my Curio orange. I'm ready for baseball, right? I mean, we're ready for baseball.
Yeah, I think you have to be at this point. I think even if you're someone who is able to find some of the Orioles games on spring TV, which there aren't a ton on Masson, but if you do the MLB TV package, you can get some more. You get to this point where it's mid-March. March Madness is upon us at this point. They're into the last full week of Grapefruit League action, and you're just ready for it to start. I mean, as much as we'll talk about Gunnar Henderson and whether he's going to be ready for opening day, and uh, obviously the Kittredge injury, Grayson Rodriguez, we think start throwing again this week, but we know it's going to be a while until we see him. Maybe late April if everything goes
It's been a
perfectly.
bad spring. Not
Yeah,
disastrous, but not good.
yeah, I mean, not as disastrous as say the Yankees with Garrett Cole, Tommy John. Luis Gil's going to be out until the summer with a lat issue like Grayson Rodriguez had last year. And over the weekend, Clark Schmidt, who was penciled in for their rotation, he's dealing with the shoulders. So, I mean, we talk about it. It's not terribly dissimilar to what we talk about in preseason football. Usually, when there are headlines this time of year, they're not great headlines. So you're trying to get to opening day. At this point, guys are starting to play a little bit more extensively in spring games. Some guys have had good springs, some guys have had bad springs, and you try not to make too much of spring numbers, and in most cases, I don't. But when you see, for example, Sir Anthony Dominguez, who's been awful this spring and really had some issues. Or on the hitting side, you look at someone like Cedric Mullins, who's really, really, really not doing much. Batting a buck 25 going into the last full week. You know, you're
I'm
at the
more worried
point.
about Rutschman, quite frankly.
Sure, and he's
Yeah.
had a good spring, right? He's had a good spring. So, and let me be clear, when I say that, that doesn't mean I'm burying Cedric Mullins or I'm burying Sir Anthony Dominguez. This is where, when you go into the last week, the last handful of games that these guys are going to play, you want guys to start feeling good about themselves. You want guys to have some success. I mean, Ryan Mountcastle has been red hot at the plate the last week or so, hitting for power, and everyone's talking about, the new left field wall, and he's one of the guys that might have been impacted more than anyone these last few years in terms of a right-handed power hitter playing half his games at Camden Yards. But you just want to see guys taste some success. You want guys to feel good about themselves going into the season. For as much as you're waiting to see what happens with Gunnar Henderson, whether he's going to be ready for the opener or whether he starts the year on the IL. For the guys that are healthy and playing regularly in spring training, you want to see them have some success. Jackson Holliday's had a really nice spring, but he had a nice spring last year. If you recall, it's why so many people were surprised when he was optioned to Norfolk at the end of the Grapefruit League action. So, it's time, right? I mean, it's time. Not everyone's healthy the way that you'd like, of course, but in terms of just the general flow of spring training, these guys are ready. You get to the last week, and you and I were in Sarasota at this time last year, for the last full week of spring training action, and you kind of you can kind of gauge it. These guys get to a point where it's like, all right, it's getting close to being that time to play for real. We know officially now Zach Eflin's going to start on opening day. There was no surprise to that, especially when Grayson Rodriguez, the health issue popped up for him. There was no question at that point. But you're trying to figure out the number 5 starter spot. Is it going to be Suarez? Is it going to be Cade Povich? What happens in the bullpen? With Kittredge out until the summer. So there's still some spots here and there to decide, but by and large, you basically know what your roster is going to be, and it's just a matter of getting a little more work in here. But it's time. It's time to start watching some baseball for real. I've noticed that the last couple spring games I've watched, Orioles or otherwise, where I look at it and it kind of has that feel of, okay, it's time for these games to start counting, and it'll be here before we know it.
Eflin as opening day starter and where the rotation is now versus where Grayson Rodriguez is still a rumor to me, and his effectiveness will still be a rumor, much like Batista out of the bullpen. But for baseball argument's sake, since we're a week and a couple of days out on opening day, what are the 5? And you rarely use 5 because you usually get the second day off. But the Orioles don't have that going on because they're playing in a dome and they're up in Toronto, so they're going to need 5 quicker than they usually do.
Yeah, it's pretty unique in that way. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because typically you do have the off day after opening day, as the Orioles will have next, the 2 weeks from now, when they're opening at home against the Red Sox, and then they'll have a day off and then play 2, and then they'll be back on the road again. So just kind of a strange early season schedule in general. But yeah, when you have no off day, you're playing in a dome, as they will be at Rogers Center. You do have to have your 5 ready to go right out of the chute. So, Brandon Hyde early in camp said that Albert Suarez was their number 6, so to speak, and this was before Grayson Rodriguez, of course. So that's kind of the logical answer. That's probably the favorite, but there is something to be said for giving Cade Povich a chance on the heels of a good September. Good September. He had a good start to the spring. I mean, he had been excellent in Grapefruit League until his last start, where he was really good until his final inning, and he got knocked around a little bit. But he's been really good overall. And the thought of you'd have a lefty in the rotation, maybe the idea that you're intrigued by the idea of Suarez in the pen, but he was also really good as a starter last year. And there's something to be said of letting that play out. And he got off to an uneven start in Grapefruit League, but his last couple times out, he's been quite good. So, we know Eflin, we know Charlie Morton's going to be there. We know Dean Kramer's going to be there. Sagano has looked very good. From I've only had a chance to catch him once in a televised game, but it's looked promising, right? I mean, I'm not saying he's going to be an all-star. Let's be clear, but I think there's some intrigue that he could exceed some of the projections out there, that you'll see at Fangraphs and things of that nature, which there's a lot of unknown. I mean, this guy's never pitched in the majors. So that can be a bad thing. That can also be a good thing. And we've seen that be a good thing at times where an international star comes to the major leagues and takes the league by storm, at least for a little while. So that really helped him out if Sagano could be better than advertised. But but we know those 4, and it's really going to come down to Albert Suarez or Cade Povich. And there's an interesting twist here because Suarez was penciled in for the pen. You move him into the rotation. Well, then logic would say, okay, well, Cade Povich could be your long man in the pen. But do you want to put Cade Povich in that role at the beginning of the season? Or if he's not going to be in your rotation, would you rather have him starting every 5th day in Norfolk because he's your next man up, right? I mean, and you're going to need starters. You need more than 5 over the course of a season. They've already tapped into their depth at this point in time. So they're still figuring that out, and health still plays a big part in that, and making sure everyone's feeling good on regular rest and everyone's staying in turn. You hope you don't get into one of these spells in Florida where you have multiple rainouts over the course of a couple of days, and kind of throws your pitching plans for a loop. But they're just trying to get everything kind of lined up schedule wise. And to your point, yeah, you need 5 right out of the gate, which I can recall some years where the Orioles haven't needed a 5th starter until 2.5 weeks into the season. So this is a little different in that regard. But hey, in this day and age, you need as much starting pitching as possible. So not exactly something that is a disadvantage or anything. It's just a little bit of a quirk playing inside for your first 4 games of the season.
Blue Jays, Red Sox. We will talk a lot about the Yankees and the Rays. But where do you see the rest? I mean, the Red Sox feel like a team that tried a little bit and
Yeah.
improved. Feels like the Blue Jays are always sort of scuffling around trying to figure out the young players that aren't young anymore. And then they spent the money on Santander, and Santander said the Orioles weren't close, right, in regard to money. The Orioles have some new players. It's a fun time of the year to evaluate these things and look and say, make my predictions, my sporting news predictions. My dad would have loved that if he lived long enough that I actually worked for Sporting News. He would have thought that was cool. But we always get the Sporting News predictions. I don't know where I make the rest of this. I mean, I feel like the Orioles can be good. And we talked so much last week about their money and Mr. Moneybags and
Yeah.
whether they're going to spend it and whether they're going to add or whether they're going to subtract and what they're really going to be when they grow up. They're in a weird transitional period where this new owner is going to have bobbleheads made for himself and all that. The team's probably going to be pretty good. It would be tremendously disappointing if the pitching's so bad that they can't be good.
Yeah, and that's where I have a tough time thinking it's going to be that bad. But there's questions. I mean, look at the Yankees right now. I mean, the Red Sox have had some guys banged up. I mean, there's no such thing as having too much pitching, and that's we knew that before the spring started, and certainly when Grayson Rodriguez goes down, and you're already feeling like you're scrambling, and you're saying, okay, well, what's going to happen on the trade market? And then you lose Kittredge, who was your big bullpen offseason addition, and he's going to be out for at least a couple months. I mean, I think the best case scenario for him is June. Now, it's a knee, so you hope he rehabs that and he comes in and he's fine, right? I mean, it's not like he's rehabbing an elbow or a shoulder or something where you start to question whether you're going to have him at all. So, there's always that. But, it's an interesting division because I think it's funny. You didn't even bring up the Rays, and you're not alone.
I did bring up the Rays, but I didn't bring up the Rays. I
But
said them, but I
you
didn't
said it in
take them
passing,
seriously.
but
Yes.
you didn't, right. But you look at the Rays, they're kind of in a position, and I'm not saying all their guys are back, but their starting pitching is getting healthier. And you think back to 2 years ago when the Orioles were deadlocked with the Rays for the entire second half of 23, neck and neck. I mean, that race went down to mid-September. I mean, that's kind of where it's, the Orioles, were in position thinking they might lose the division. And they had that big series in Baltimore where, went back and forth. But I think for even the Rays, there's a path for them to compete. Now, it's not the conventional path. I mean, how many times over the last, I mean, we're going 2008 is when they made that World Series run. I mean, that was 17 years ago at this point in time. So they're right there in terms of having more upside pitching wise. I mean, certainly you question the bats and just the makeup of their roster collectively, but I'm not counting them out. Toronto, of course, was such a big disappointment last year. They did get Santander. They still, if their pitching can stay healthy and they can kind of get back to where they were a few years ago. I mean, keep in mind, I mean, they were kind of the Orioles before the Orioles, really exploded in terms of this team that had this young core and everyone was excited about them, and then it just, kind of just flamed out the last year or two. I had some injuries, some guys not perform, and you kind of look at it, and they were famously finishing second place for all these big time free agents until they did land Santander. But I think for me, the most intriguing is Boston just because of some of the young players that they already had that were, on the come. What they did in terms of adding Alex Bregman. Obviously, there's been some drama as far as Devers and whether he'll DH, even though Bregman's a superior third baseman. It seems like that's trending towards what you would expect, which is to to play Bregman at third base, or they should anyway. Obviously the big acquisition was Garrett Crochet. You've heard me talk about how much I like the Walker Bueller signing for them in terms of upside on a 1 year deal, albeit an expensive 1 year deal. But they're dealing with some health concerns here and there as well. So I think you go down the list, all five of these teams have things you like about them, and all five of these teams have some question marks. I don't think any of these teams look dominant on paper. The Yankees were the closest to that, but when Garrett Cole gets Tommy John surgery, and he's not a maybe like Grayson Rodriguez or some of these other guys, or Luis Heel for the Yankees, he's done, right? He's not pitching in 2025. That brought the Yankees back to the rest of the pack, and then you consider Heel, and Giancarlo Stanton, what's going to happen with his elbows, right? I mean, as I said to you over and over last year, as we were handicapping the race between the Orioles and the Yankees last year, even though the Yankees ultimately prevailed, a big part of their success was one, Aaron Judge having an amazing year, Juan Soto having an amazing year, and some guys that had some health concerns staying relatively healthy. I mean, the Yankees have a lot of 30 somethings that they're counting on. So, whether you think they're still the favorite for the division or not, I think that's up for debate a little bit more now. It's not to say the Orioles are. That's not to say the Red Sox are. I think this is not a bad division because I've heard some people kind of call it weak. I don't think it's weak by any stretch of the imagination. I think all five teams have elements to them that are appealing. All five teams have elements to them that are a question mark or a concern. And the Orioles, we've talked at length about some of their concerns, but I've also tried to remind over and over, just about any team in baseball would gladly take their young core of position players right now. Even acknowledging Gunnar being banged up and questionable for at least the first week or so of the season. So, I think the division was the Yankees as the favorite before the Cole injury, and now I think it's very debatable. You could make an argument for the Orioles. I think you can make an argument for the Red Sox. I have a tougher time really making an argument for the Blue Jays or the Rays to win the division, but that doesn't mean that they can't be right there in the thick of it and be a wild card, a playoff caliber kind of team. So I think that's kind of the state of the whole American League, isn't it? Right? I mean, Cleveland last year, is their bullpen going to duplicate what they did a year ago? And the out west, I mean, you look at the losses that the Astros had, and Texas. Okay, I think there's upside for the Rangers to bounce back from what was just kind of a lost year for them. Seattle, they're dealing with health concern in their rotation, and can they hit, right? I mean, that's been the knock on the Mariners for years now. I mean, they've got a good rotation. Are they going to get enough offense? So, I think the state of the entire American League for me is it's real. It really feels wide open. That's why it's so intriguing. When you're talking about a Dylan Cease or, I've talked about you and I sparred over David Robertson last week in the Orioles. There are other teams dealing with bullpen health concerns right now. So, not that you're going to have the trade market come to a resolution in late March, but there's very much going to be an arms race, so to speak, I think, with the way that the American League looks on paper. And who's going to make the big move? Who's going to be able to stay the healthiest at this point in time? But I just look at the American League and its totality, and as much as I understand Orioles fans being disappointed about the offseason, I mean, I called it underwhelming myself, and it stinks that Grayson Rodriguez is dealing with this and not knowing if you're going to have his upside or when you're going to have it. Questions about the bullpen, with Kittredge, or even though Batista I think is trending in the right direction, still going to be some questions about where he is and how quickly they can lean on him and depend on him. But I think where you take some satisfaction, where you take some consolation, is that you can kind of do this with all these teams in the division, and I think you can do it largely with the whole league. So it really is a matter of your young guys taking a step forward, trying to stay as healthy as they can from this point, knowing they've already dealt with some attrition here in the spring, and you got to go out there and perform. So, I mean, it's kind of a long-winded way of saying I don't really know, because I think all these teams have things that you like, but I think all these teams in this division have elements to them that you really have some question marks about. Yes, even including the Yankees now, with just the fact that they were older to begin with. And when you take, it's one thing to talk about Grayson Rodriguez. It's another thing to talk about a bona fide Cy Young Award winner in Garrett Cole, who you're you counted on to be your horse, not just in terms of innings, but to be that legit number one. And there are only so many around baseball. When you completely take that out of the equation, you have the same questions we have about the Orioles right now, which is how do you replace Corbin Burns for the Yankees? How do you replace Garrett Cole? And there's no simple answer to that, even if either one of these teams does go and get Dylan Cease at some point in time. That's still not quite the same as replacing the horse that you had previously.
Well, it's also how they come out of the gate and whether they can win the one-run ball games like they did during Buck's era, or pull in the right relief pitching and circumstances and Brandon Hyde. And I mean, at the end of the day, you tap a guy in the sixth, seventh inning, go out there, send him out there with two guys on. They either get out of it or they blow the game up. And it's that bullpen part of it that we'll spend time on Rutschman. And I was going to bring up Jackson Holiday, and I still will, as well as Gunnar Henderson, because the ises have to be ises, right? There can be no more regression for Rutschman if Henderson's going to start the season injured and Holiday's going to be back in AAA by May 30th because he can't do it because he's young. I mean, a lot of these guys still young, dealing with success, trying to find success. No success in October for any of these guys, really. There's nothing to hang your hat on after two really good seasons. New ownership, more money, a couple of bought pitchers in the rotation in Sugano and Charlie Morton that are just rentals, essentially. Charlie Morton's 41 years old. They're not
Yeah.
buying him, you're renting him. So I think they still have more work to do. And to your point, that really speaks to the long argument we had last week about Elias and Rubenstein and money, because they're going to have to add money to this.
Yeah, I mean,
That was always taboo the last 30 years, right? Saying in opening
right.
day we're going to add money. That just has
Well,
never happened here. So bringing that up is a little I don't know. I'm projecting that onto them because I think they want to win as bad as we do. I don't know. I mean, I really
yeah.
don't know.
Well, I mean,
I know they want to make money. I know that.
well, and what kind of money is it? Is it in the sense of just payroll? Like, okay, you go sign David Robertson, which at this point, whoever's signing David Robertson or whoever's signing Kyle Gibson or whatever veteran pitcher that is still a free agent, when you sign them, are they going to be? They're not going to be ready for opening day, right? I mean, you're getting into that territory now where even if you make an addition like that, the question is how quickly can they be ready? But whether it's just point blank payroll or whether it's trading assets in your system, which that is money, right? I mean, you think about the value of trading, and they're not going to do it, but I'll just use his name because he's had a great spring. But Sam Basayo, who's been terrific. I mean, the way he hits, and I've seen him, I've seen him hit a couple long balls, and it looks like he handles himself well. I mean, they
How
might
old
have
is
a
he?
good.
19?
He's 20. I mean,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, this kid's he's impressive, and they might have a really good problem on their hands. And when I say problem, it's not really a problem because you need two catchers anyway. They might have a good problem on their hands if he goes to Norfolk and just rips things up for 3 months and does everything they ask him to do behind the plate. I mean, they might be in a position where they might be trying to get him on the roster in August, just to have another bat, off the bench or DH or what have you. But someone like Basayo, we've been Jack. I mean, all these young prospects. I mean, the value that they have. I mean, it's through the roof if they are as good as advertised in terms of cheap labor for 6 years. I mean, that's Gunnar Henderson is such an extraordinary asset right now because he is the Orioles' Aaron Judge, yet he's making a tiny, tiny percentage of what Aaron Judge is making at this point. So, but you have to decide. You have to manage your assets. You have to manage your payroll and kind of, understand what your budget is. Try to project out what the next 5 years are going to look like with, your stadium renovations and figuring out TV. The future of Masson, the future of local TV revenue, which every team in baseball is trying to figure out right now. But there's a lot of projecting that goes on here, a lot of projection that goes on here that they're trying to figure out. But yeah, I mean, they certainly need their in-house options to pan out, right? I mean, if Gunnar Henderson's not going to be ready for opening day, fine. You don't rush him back. If he has to miss the first week, if he has to miss the first 10 days of the season, so be it. He's that important. You can't just have this short-sighted approach where you're saying, "Oh, he's got to be ready for opening day." No, he's got to be ready for a 6-month season and then October. And the last thing you want is him dealing with a rib cage issue all year, trying to swing the bat at a MVP caliber level. So you have to be smart there. But yeah, they need Adley Rutschman to be Adley Rutschman. That's kind of a for me. If this team's going to reach its full potential, like that's one of those things that's a requisite. Like that's a given that he has to look like Adley Rutschman again.
I think Jackson Holiday has to come on this year because they're really counting on him. There's no Adam
Yeah,
Kennedys or Frazier, whatever the guys
sure.
2 years ago. It was Kennedy. I was going back 20 years, but filling guys, and they got rid of their second baseman in the deal last year with the Marlins. So he has to be an is,
Yeah.
not a might be. And
Well,
they
and
were
and
just projecting a lot on the young players. That's all. I mean, and I remember every Craig Worthington and every Ken Gerhardt and every Bobby Baylor. I mean, just projecting a lot on the young players. Henderson has arrived. Yeah, the rest of them. I mean,
well,
Rutschman.
Rutschman's a two-time All-Star. Let's we
Okay.
need we need to be we need to be balanced in how we view Adley Rutschman. Look, I was as hard on him last the second half last year as anyone,
Well,
but
then why
let's
didn't
not
you say he was injured? I mean, I don't get this. I don't understand if he was injured.
I I don't really get it either, but maybe he's stubborn that he doesn't want people to think he's making an excuse for how he played because
Dude, he
it
hit a
was
buck and a half
I know. Well, it wasn't a buck and a half, but it was bad.
for a while.
Well, it was like 185 or 190, whatever it was. Point is, we need to be balanced in understanding that Adley Rutschman looked like a fringe MVP candidate for 2 years before that second half. I mean, this guy was almost immediately he needed about 3.5 weeks when he was first called up, struggled the first month or so. And then from that point on, he played like an all-star catcher. So
I mean, he was the best player on the team very
Right,
quickly.
exactly. So I want to be fair with how we view Adley. But that said, he needs to go back to being that guy immediately, right? You can't if Adley Rutschman's hitting 200 the first month of the season, that's concerning, right? Because then it's not just he had a bad second half. Now it's he's had bad his last 4 months of Major League Baseball. He's been a below replacement level hitter. So so they absolutely need that. You mentioned Jackson Holiday. Look, there are layers to that. Does Jackson Holiday need to be an all-star this year? No, but he needs to be a legitimate, bona fide major league second baseman. He needs to be above replacement level. And I think there's lots of reason to expect that, right? I mean, understanding, look at what Gunnar Henderson did his cup of coffee year late in 22. Then he was rookie of the year in 23, and then he was an MVP candidate. Colton Cowser 2 years ago looked like he didn't belong in the major leagues. Last year finished second in rookie of the year. So we've seen Jordan Westburg was league average his first year in the majors. He was an all-star last year before he broke his was hit on the hand with the pitch and spent the last 2 months or so on the IL. But so there's a track record here of their young guys, even their young guys struggling initially, and then really making a big jump after that. So, I'm not going to sit here and predict Jackson Holiday to be playing in the All-Star game, but I do think he can be an above average player for them and really settle in. Hey, he might have to be their shortstop for the first week or two of the season. I mean, that's kind of where, Gunner's making progress and doing baseball activity, but the fact that we're a week and a half out and still talking about him getting into spring games. I mean, that's telling you they're running out of time for him to be ready for opening day, So, but you mentioned how much they're putting on the young guys. I mean, wasn't that always the plan? That was the whole genesis of this 5-year rebuild was you were going to draft all these players and you have this amazing farm system and so it better work. It needs to work, right? I mean, and I'll hear anyone who says, you'd like to have another veteran player or two in the mix. I'm not anti that. I was saying that last October, just like anyone else. But at the same time, anyone they were going to bring in, realistically speaking, it was always going to be about Gunnar Henderson, Adley Rutschman, Jordan Westburg, Jackson Holiday, Colton Cowser. We'll see about Kobe Mayo's having a rough spring. He's he's not going to start the year in the major leagues, barring an injury. We'll see about Basayo later in the year.
Yeah, the
Uh, you know,
Mayo thing, right? Like
yeah,
he's a
that's it.
guy that they
It's
expect to hit
disappointing.
42 home runs one day, like Santander, right?
Well, And, he-
Literally.
and and look, Anthony Santander, go back and look at how he played early in his career. I mean, he wasn't, he didn't become a 40 home run guy overnight. Some guys take longer, but it is a little discouraging just because Mayo had a good spring last year, and not that there was much expectation that he was going to make the roster out of spring training because there wasn't, but
But he was a
it,
disaster when they called him up, though,
yeah, I
right?
mean, he
I
just really,
mean,
really struggled. And look, I mean, the profile for him, he's a big kid. He's got huge power, but he does have swing and miss. And sometimes when you're that kind of player, it takes a while to figure it out. So,
well, you look like Dave Kingman on your best day,
yeah,
and Ryan Mountcastle. We're into him being the most veteran guy on the team. I mean,
yeah,
I don't know if Kobe Mayo came up and became Ryan Mountcastle, whether that's what they think or eclipse that. Mountcastle has not been a bad major league player, he's made some money, whatever, but
solid.
like. Yeah, solid, but
Yeah,
not unspectacular. And I think with Kobe Mayo, they felt like they might have a real. I mentioned Santander, and there's a guy that really outkicked his coverage, out hit
he's a Rule
his.
5 guy. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, literally, I think they think differently of Mayo, especially at the age, and feel like he could be a cleanup hitter when Henderson's winning MVPs and Rutschman's vying for MVPs and Jackson Holliday's vying for, when all that's going on around them, I still think they think Mayo could be a 35 home run guy. Maybe he'll hit 221 and, strike out 164 times, but I think they see him as a guy that's going to be on this team. I don't think they would have rushed him into a middle of pennant race last year if they didn't believe that.
yeah. Or he's the guy they trade for an ace at some point, right? I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
no, I'm just saying. I mean, he could be that guy as well. And let's be clear. I mean, Kobe Mayo just turned 23 back in December, so you're still talking about a young player. As much as you know, because Gunnar became the player that he did so quickly, because Jackson Holliday made his major league debut at age 20. We have to remember when someone's 22 or 23, that's still really young for the majors, right? Uh, you know, how you view Mayo should not be the same way that we view Heston Kjerstad, who I'd be remiss if I didn't mention. Like, this is a big year for Heston Kjerstad. He
Huge.
needs to look like that guy, or he's going to be the guy that's traded as part of a package for an ace, and maybe
Well,
that.
if they all
Oh,
stink, then they're not getting traded for an
well,
ace. You know what I
well,
mean?
well, it, 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 it all depends, right? I mean, it depends on, do they have some diminished value? Like Kobe Mayo right now, does he have as much trade value as he had a year ago? Maybe not, but I also don't think his rough cup of coffee last year completely eliminates his trade value or anything crazy like that either. I think he's still very highly regarded, and but he struggled in 41 at bats. 41 at bats is 41 at bats. It's not much, but it certainly wasn't indicative of someone who was completely ready to tear the cover off the ball in the major leagues. But Colton Cowser looked pretty woeful his first run in the major leagues and finished second in Rookie of the Year last year. So I think for Mayo, he was never going to be on this major league roster, barring an injury coming out of spring training, because Mountcastle and O'Hearn are still on the roster. I think if they had dealt one of those guys in the offseason, then Mayo's path would have been a little more realistic. But you would have liked, I would have liked to have seen Mayo have a better spring than what we've seen. He's kind of been pressing. He hasn't necessarily had quite as much of a strikeout issue compared to what he did when he got caught up to the majors last year. But it just hasn't, he hasn't popped. He hasn't had a spring to instill confidence, and that's where it's been a little deflating. But that's not to say he can't go to AAA for a month and completely rake and look different in the eyes of their coaches and scouts. And he's up in June because the Orioles made, someone got hurt or some roster shuffling, whatever, and suddenly he's everything they thought he was going to be. Or he ends up being the centerpiece for them to go get a number one starter at some point in time. I mean, I think that's for anyone that's not named Gunnar Henderson or Adley Rutschman, or at this point, I'm close to putting Westberg in that category. I'm very close to putting Cowser in that category. But these guys that are still establishing themselves, talking like Kjerstad or Mayo, or they're If they're going
But
to make a
let's say
trade,
the Tigers stink and a guy like Scooble becomes available. Cowser's going to have to be. You know what I mean? They're going to have to put real players in that kind of deal.
I don't know if Cowser has to be in that.
Okay.
I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I think a lot of that depends. How did they feel about? I mean, let's be clear. Kobe Mayo is still regarded as a top 15 prospect in baseball. Like this isn't someone who, I think the
Well,
worst
that's
baseball.
why I'm bringing up they think
Yeah,
he's going to back cleanup in 2027,
but my
28, 29 and he'd be a
my
pile diver. They
right,
and
but my
an
point is
inexpensive one. When they have to pay Gunner, they wouldn't have to pay him just yet, you know?
right. But my point I was just making, like Colton Cowser's already part of a contending club. You're not trading a contending a very valuable player that's already on your major league roster
I don't
for.
know. To get a number one starter, I would do almost anything at this point because I feel like they've failed on that. I mean,
I
unless
mean,
something
okay.
steps up and Rodriguez is, I just,
I mean, I
they
think
don't have
Colton
enough pitching
Cowser's
right now.
really who who's your outfield moving
Well,
forward. I
then
mean,
that's where Kerstead
yeah,
and the rest of these guys have to
no,
step
but I'm
up.
just saying. I mean, because Cedric Mullins is in the last year of team control. They're not extending him. I mean, Cedric Mullins.
Cedric Mullins might not get 218 at bats this year because he
Well,
might not be good
but
enough.
my point is that's why you need Colton Cowser for the future, right? I mean, you're not like he's going to be the guy that kind of anchors your outfield.
No,
Anyway,
I'm
we're
just saying if they're going to make a deal for a, I said Scooble. I didn't
yeah.
say even Cease, who's a real rental.
I'm
But
saying
if they're going to make a deal to think that we're just going to give up the scraps who are hitting 218 in Norfolk, that's not. Basayo, as an example, has moved into a place where you don't want to deal him for anything or anybody at this point.
probably not.
Right. This time last year, Scooble been maybe that would have been the poison pill. You have to give something up to
Sure.
get these guys.
Well, that's why I
I,
said Kobe Mayo. Kobe Mayo's a very serious prospect.
I mean, the
You're
Orioles gave up something to get Corbin Burns and rent him last year. We're not feeling because we already have a shortstop. But the Brewers are going to feel his 540 at bats this year.
yeah, but he's go. Joey Ortiz was a fringe top 100 prospect. I
I
mean,
got you.
Kobe Mayo has been a top 15 prospect in baseball. I mean, my point is with me saying like Kobe Mayo would be the centerpiece of a deal for an ace. I mean, I'm not saying that's the only thing you have to give up. You know that you'd have to include some, but he still should be regarded in that way. You know, we're not talking. This isn't Kyle Stowers and talking about guys like that, right? I mean, Kyle Stowers was never a highly regarded prospect. He was an okay prospect at his best, but Connor Norby was never a highly touted prospect. He was an okay prospect, and we saw what that got them. Those two guys got them Trevor Rogers, who wasn't good, and now he's hurt. So, but again, we're kind of getting into the weeds talking about a hypothetical deal that, I don't think the
Well, there's
Tigers
going to
are
be a deal. They're going to have to go get pitching.
well, but
Unless Grayson
hypothetical.
Rodriguez comes back on April 19th
Sure.
and goes forward, they
My
need more
point was
pitching.
that it's going to be, Scooble. I mean, I think for one, I think the Tigers are going to be pretty good. I mean,
I
I'm not
agree.
saying they're going to win 100 games, but I don't think what they did last year was completely a fluke down the stretch. But that said, we'll see. So, but yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, this is the same point I made to you throughout the second half last year, and it didn't work out for them because they struggled. But anything talking about the trade deadline or anyone you're bringing in, this still goes back to this team is going to win on the back of its young position talent. It's what their entire foundation was built on that. So to sit here and say that it's going to be something else that allows them to break through, yeah, they need to add another. They're going to have to add another starting pitcher, barring something really strange here. Barring Sagano being an all-star
Or Povich or one of these guys
yeah,
really
or
make
Povich
it make it
suddenly
a
looking
move.
like a
Yeah.
number three starter, which look, one of those things could happen. And if it does, it puts less pressure on you at the deadline. But that
Dude, if he
said,
looks like Jeff Ballard for a minute or Wei and Chen for a year, right? Like it just
I
doesn't
mean,
need
if
to
it could
look
be Wei and
great. It
Chen,
just
that'd
needs to
be
look
great.
good. Yeah,
Yeah,
it
I mean,
needs to look good.
Wei and Chen was a really rock solid number three starter for 4 years. So, but we're going to see how this plays out, and ultimately, you got to stay healthy. I think for these young guys, you're asking a lot, but a lot. These young guys have already given you a lot in terms of, Rutschman's a two-time All-Star, second half aside last year. Gunnar Henderson was an MVP candidate last year, arguably the MVP of the league the first 2.5, 3 months of the season. Cowser was second in Rookie of the Year. Westberg was an All-Star. Now the time has come for Kerstad to step up, and you need Jackson Holiday to really figure it out this year. There's no reason to think he can't. I mean, wasn't the Orioles hyping him up? I mean, all of baseball was talking about Jackson Holiday being the best prospect in baseball a year ago at this time, and he's still that, other than just from the stance that he's officially graduated, right? In terms of from prospect status. So, it's time. And look, some people might be a little leery of leaning that hard on young players. And to your point, that hasn't worked out in October, going that route. But at some point in time, they have to break through. And you can find all types of examples in across sports. We talked about it with the Ravens a lot the last 5 years, in terms of teams that couldn't win in football's case, January, or teams that couldn't win in October until they finally do. The Dodgers, the Dodgers. How much have we talked about them for the last decade? For all the money they've spent, how many World Series have they won? They finally broke through in a bona fide, full blown 162 game non-COVID season last year to win a World Series, and they've spent a billion, you know, billions of dollars to do it.
Billions with
Yeah,
an S, yes.
billions.
It's
But
like Carl Sagan.
I mean, Dave Roberts a year ago at this time, people were talking about, well, if they don't win in 24, do they need to move on? Well, he just got a nice extension, and well deserved for Dave Roberts. But the point is, even the Dodgers spending more money than anyone can even comprehend, they still had a bit of a rep for coming up small in October. I mean, even go look at their run last year. They were they were teetering in the division rounds, the division series. So, I mean, it's not easy. And so much of it in October still comes down to a little more random event, a little more luck than you care to admit. I mean, it's just the truth if you understand the nature of baseball. But you've got to do everything you can to get to that point. You've got to do everything you can to get to that point and feel like you have a roster that's constructed to win in October. And yeah, I'm in agreement with you. The Orioles still have work to do on that front. That said, doesn't mean that they can't go into the regular season and win a lot of games and be on the right track. And then as you get closer to the deadline, you get into the summer months, you kind of assess where you are. You assess payroll and the makeup of your team, your prospects, where they are in terms of their trade value, where everyone else is, and then you try to make some well-informed decisions, understanding that there's going to be a lot of unknown. But I'll continue to go back to the point I made to you throughout the winter. For as much as there are some questions about this team, I'll still say they have a lot going for them as far as their young talent, and I will still bet more heavily on legitimate young talent, legitimate, not like just hyped guys that you like but no one else really likes. Legitimate young talent compared to where a lot of teams are, which is hoping that 30 somethings hold on for another year. And that's where I think the Yankees, bringing it back to compared to the rest of the AL East, I think that's where the Yankees are a little more shaky than some people care to admit, because we've already seen it. They haven't even broken camp, and you look at how much they're dealing with and just how many older players they're really counting on to help them navigate what's going to be a 2025 without your ace and Garrett Cole.
All right, Luke, we got a week left before we go to Canada. I have my passport. My passport's I grabbed it and I pulled it out just so I would actually have it. So passport, United States of America. Here I am. So with my Canada hat. So I just want to say this to you before, because we'll talk a little more baseball. I had to Google this because last week I tried to teach you the words to the OK Blue Jay song because we're going to
Mm-hmm.
Toronto. So it's OK Blue Jays. Let's play ball. So like let's play ball is just play ball, right? It's opening day, but in Canada they do it a little different. So I was worried that they weren't going to play this in the seventh inning because I haven't been to a Blue Jays game in 10 years since 2015 when I did the
Sure, yeah.
baseball tour. Big Poppy and I hung out that day. He was the greatest. I had BP with Big Poppy. But nonetheless, they do play it. AI is great, right? So I AI this. Yes, the Toronto Blue Jays still play okay Blue Jays during the seventh inning stretch of their home game, a tradition that began, strangely enough, in 1983. Kind of weird year
Hmm.
for us here. The song written by John Lococo and recorded by Keith Hampshire and the Bat Boys is a staple of the seventh inning stretch. It is a tradition. It was remixed in 2003, and I fully expect you to be on your feet singing it. They also, it's weird up there. Their hot dogs, they put like poppy seeds on the bun. You have to get used to that. A little different than.
Mm,
Um, you've never been to Canada, correct?
I
Ever?
have not. This will be my first time.
All right. I'm gonna
You
let
said
you.
I look like a hockey player, so I should fit right in, even though I've never played a day, played
You look
hockey a
like you
day
could
in
be a
my life.
right wing. I give you a right wing. Yeah, I mean, yeah,
I
absolutely. You
can't even skate.
don't tell him that. Look, throw us out. Don't let us in. Don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Luke Jones and I are headed to Toronto, Canada, to be with Geddy Lee, amongst other things, and the Toronto Blue Jays. We'll be there next week on opening day. Luke swears he has a passport. Dude, if you don't have a passport, we both get. Do you sure you want to go across the border with the Latin guy, with the guy from Venezuela? I don't know, but we'll look. If they let me stay and let you win, just send my belt buckles or something. That's all I could say at this point. But I am an American. Even though my father was born in Venezuela, did I just admit that? I put chapter one of my book on my father up at Baltimore Positive because I want people to understand my love of Oriole baseball. I want Mr. Rubenstein to understand. I understand he's doing a special luncheon this week as well for the CEO Club of Baltimore as well. So it is baseball season. I don't know if I'm a real media member. I'll find out later on this week. I hope to be in Toronto with the press pass with Luke, but I'll be in Toronto either way, drinking expensive beer, cheap everything else because, we're putting those tariffs on them up there. So we'll see how that goes next week. But Luke and I are going to talk some Canadian baseball as we get ready for the legend of Dave Steeb and the Sky Dome. Oh, man, Sky Dome. I have so many stories for you, Luke. Joe Carter, the home run. It was something. Mitch Williams, Kurt Schilling, John Kruk, Lenny Dykstra. It was all there. That was 1993. My God, 32 years. I'm Nestor. He's Luke. We're going back to Canada because baseball starts there.